Hey, so welcome this afternoon to our next presentation in our Historic Speaker Series. Our presentation this afternoon will be by Tom Holmquist. Tom has been a longtime educator in this area, and he is probably the most knowledgeable person that I know of when it comes to Swedish immigration to this area. So I will turn it over to Tom.
Good afternoon, everyone. Glad for you to join us here this afternoon and to join the Old Bill. It's my pleasure to be here and spend a little time with you and talk about the Smoky Valley churches of the southern Saline County. The first slide that you're seeing here today is a Pioneer Cross. This is the northernmost hill of the Smoky Hills that line the Smoky Valley to the west. And the cross was made by Carl Lindholm in the late 1930s, early 1940s as a monument to honor the pioneers who came here and settled. And of course, that cross is something that we see every day as we look across the valley. This presentation then is about the churches and their founding. And so I would first turn to Salemsborg Church. If I can get, there we go. Salemsborg Church. And the Salemsborg Church was founded in 1869. Most of the people who settled in the Salemsborg area were from the Småland province, some from Bleking and Östergötland. But for the most of them came from Småland. And they came here by way of Galesburg, Illinois. They had been members at First Lutheran Church in Galesburg or the Lutheran Church in Swedonia. And after the Civil War, they were looking for a place to settle as a community, and they found this place in the Smoky Valley. The church that you see here is the only depiction that we have of this building. This was the dugout church. It was erected there at the site of the Salemsborg property in October of 1869, and it was made of sod. It was very crude and very difficult to keep. In those first times there, when this sod church was in place, one of the major problems that they had was rattlesnakes. And there was a young man who lived next to just a quarter of a mile away, and he was hired to come in the mornings before our services and clear all the rattlesnakes out of the sod church. The first church service was held on Thanksgiving of 1869, and so Brodeen became really the center of this community. When he passed away in 1895, the people there dug his grave and they hauled in extra dirt. And even today in the Salemsborg Cemetery, his grave stands higher and his stone is higher than any of the others because the people all said, "Let him watch over us for eternity like he watched over us in life." He was an important man. His great-grandson also became an important man. His great-grandson is John Carlin, who was governor of Kansas and the national archivist for the United States during the Clinton administration. That first pastor there was a really extraordinary young man by the name of Pastor A.W. Dahlsten. He was pastor of First Lutheran in Galesburg, Illinois. And then when his people, so many of them left his congregation to come to Kansas, he wanted to come with them. He was a part of the Galesburg Land Company that found the land here, and then he really wanted to come and be the first pastor. He served the Salemsborg congregation from 1869 to 1889. By 1872, the Salemsborg Church, the dugout church, was completely inadequate. So they moved just a few feet away, and they built this, what is called the frame church. And if you notice, it is really a prairie construction, but it has the steeple that is a Swedish design. And it was really an important church. This is truly the church that Pastor Dahlsten served during his time there for 18 years. Then in 1893, it was decided to build yet another church. And this was a huge structure. This is known as the spire church. The spire that you see stood 160 feet in the air and could be seen from Lindsborg and also from Saline. This construction started in 1893 and it was completed in 1897. The interior of that church was also spectacular. And as you notice here in the center of the picture here is a very important painting. It is the altar painting Transfiguration of Christ by Carl Latov. He was for a short time a professor of art at Bethany College. And while he was here, he was commissioned to do this painting. If you look up Carl Latov on Wikipedia and other places, you will find that the first notation of his artworks is the altar painting at Salemsborg. He also was a portraitist and also a painter, and has many of his paintings are featured in the governor's palace in Santa Fe, New Mexico, of southwestern scenes. The second pastor at Salemsborg was also a very extraordinary man by the name of Carl Wallin. He is the man who built that spire church. He built the park that is at Salemsborg, and he worked hard for the people here. He was very unhappy most of the time, and toward the end of his period here, he resigned 3 different times. He was refused resignation by the people of Salemsborg. He lived in a very poor parsonage, and instead of allowing him to resign and retire, they built him a new house because he was so loved. And you can see here is a picture from about 1915, and you see that spire church. This is facing to the north, and you see that house that they built for Pastor Wallin. It was built by the Holmquist brothers of Lindsborg. A very extraordinary man also served as pastor of Salemsborg. His name was Pastor Gustav Eriksson, and he was such a brilliant and extraordinary man. And what he brought with him was his absolutely love of music and the arts, and inspired hundreds and hundreds of children to become good musicians. He was also a man of great interest and a true adventurer. Here you see him in his 1908 Buick Model 10 car. He was absolutely the first Augustana Lutheran pastor to own and drive a car. He was such an interesting man. And you see his beautiful wife, Minnie, sitting next to him. One of the other things that he did in his few minutes of spare time was to make whirligigs. And here on the top of the outhouse behind the parsonage, you will see 2 of his whirligigs. And there were many of them. And when they would fall apart or blow down, he would build more. Extraordinary man. You can see the inside of that church. Here is the spire church as it was decorated for a Christmas celebration about 1915. And here you can see that same church, and it is ordained for the funeral of Fred Frost, who was killed in action in the Argonne during World War I, when his body was returned here for burial in the Salemsborg Cemetery. In July of 1925, lightning struck the spire church. And despite all efforts to save it, the church burned to the ground. But in the meantime, men from the congregation rode on horseback up to the church as it was burning in the steeple, and they ran inside and they carried out numerous articles. But most importantly, they took their pocket knife out of their pants and cut the altar painting Karlatov's transfiguration from the wall of the church and carried it out and saved it. One of the interesting things about that time was that just 2 months earlier, that the congregation had voted to change from Swedish as used in the services to English. And the people of Salemsborg, when they saw their church down, they thought sure that it was God's wrath upon them for having changed from having church in God's language, which was Swedish, of course. So when they built a new church, and this was Pastor Erickson, which we saw a few slides back, they decided that they needed to hedge their bets. So you notice that the new church has 2 towers. The north tower, it says, "A mighty fortress is our God," in Swedish. And in the south tower, it says the same in English. And tradition has that then, on happy occasions like a wedding or a baptism, that you enter the church through the Swedish tower, and on a sad occasion, you enter through the English tower. That tradition was kept for many years, but not today. And you can see that interior church with that great transfiguration painting. This is the 2-tower church that stands to this day. Just a mile north of Salemsborg was the Salemsborg Mission Hill Free Church. Now, these were also people from mostly Östergötland, some from Småland, but they were from the Lazer, the Readers movement. And they did not agree with the Lutheran teachings, but were a more evangelical type of teachings in their worship. And so they built their own church just a mile north of where the Salemsborg Church stands on what is called still today Mission Hill. Here is the interior of that church, decorated for a Christmas. And you can notice the used krona at the top of the posts there. And very important part of Swedish tradition. One of the real interesting things about this tiny church, this Mission Hill Church, was that this man was raised, baptized, and brought up in that little tiny Mission Hill Church. His name was, he became Reverend Theodore Anderson. He later became the leader of the Covenant Church in North America and led the Covenant Church from 1932 to 1958. He was born about a mile and a half west of Småland and brought up here. Also in the little town of Småland, which is 4 miles north of Salemsborg, was this church. They also had a free church there in Småland. But in the tornado of 1892, which destroyed all of Småland, destroyed that church. And then from the wreckage of what they could find to rebuild, they built this building as the Småland Free Church. It was a non-denominational, but it was a Lazer Readers church. Later, this church was built. The Mission Church was closed, and 2 miles to the south, and they came together, and the Mission Covenant Church in Småland was built. And this building still stands in Småland today, although it has been rebuilt to be an apartment house. Here is the interior of that church, the Småland Covenant Church. You notice the altar painting, and it is that altar painting is now a part of the New Gotland Covenant Church south of Lindsborg. To the north of Lindsborg, just near the Saline County line, was the Free Church originally that became part of the Mission Covenant Church at Rose Hill. And this building stood there at the Rose Hill site. However, it didn't stay long because it was destroyed by the tornado of 1876 that was so devastating to the whole valley. And so that church only lasted a couple of years as a building itself. And then that church then moved to Lindsborg. Here is a monument to that church at the Rose Hill Cemetery site. when that church was destroyed, the congregation moved itself to Lindsborg, which is in McPherson County, they built this very unusual looking church there on the corner of Washington and Lincoln Streets, just west of Main Street in Lindsborg. And it must have been an extraordinary building if you could just look at the architecture of that building. And my, wouldn't that be something if it still existed today? The present Lindsborg Covenant Church is still located at that very site today. This building was torn down, and the modern Covenant Church was built in 1927. Back to Smolen. Smolen Lutheran Church was founded in 1904. And it was a small church that sat in the middle of town, just a block from the Covenant Church. And you notice that we're going to see several of these smaller churches. And the reason that they were built was it was just too far to walk all the way to Salemsborg. Most of the people who were members of this congregation lived to the north of Smolen, and so it would have been 7, 8, 9 mile walk or ride in a wagon or a carriage all the way to Salemsborg. And so that they split off to form the Smolen Covenant Church. Here is the interior of that Smolen Covenant Church, and you can see the altar painting of Jesus carrying the cross, which there's a lot more to that story and the real history of the Smolen Covenant Church. The pastor here is Pastor George Hall, who was the pastor at the Smolen for just 2 years, from 1936 to 1938. Interestingly, though, about him, they had a baby at the time here, and that baby girl grew up to be a woman who then later joined the Symbionese Liberation Army. And some of you remember that, and that they kidnapped Patty Hearst. And that girl, his daughter, was killed in a shootout with the police in Los Angeles while she was supporting the Symbionese Liberation Army. Kind of an interesting aside to a really fine man. Others extraordinary pastors who served that Smolen Lutheran Church was Pastor A.W. Dahlsten's son Luther, who came. He had been pastor at Pasadena, California, and left Pasadena to come to Smolen. Can you imagine going from Pasadena, that difficult climate there, to come to we're at the end of the rainbow in Smolen, Kansas? Also, after him, Sir A.S. Sagerhammer, an extraordinarily prominent pastor in the Augustana Synod, was there from 21 to 27. And another extraordinary man, J.P. Leaf, was there from 1928 to 1931. Excellent and great leaders of the Augustana Lutheran Church. Assyria is another one of the churches that were founded because of just the distance it took to travel to Salemsborg. The Salemsborg parish at the beginning of time was about 1,000 square miles, and it just was too big. And so Assyria Lutheran was founded in 1876. Interesting also, most of the people who have settled in this part of the parish were from Blaking and from Shirkult Parish in the west part of Blaking, and they wanted their church over there because they were Blakings and wanted their own way of doing things, but also because of the great distance it was to Salemsborg. Here's the interior of that church. It was an extraordinary place. Here is the Assyria Lutheran Church as it is today, and it is a beautiful and important congregation. Here is the interior of the Assyria Lutheran Church sanctuary. This picture is from about 1974, and it has changed very little over the course of time. Even again, farther to the east was the Hallville Lutheran Church, or Hallville Chapel, it was known. And again, this was east of the river, and of course, when the Smoky Hill River was in flood stage or too high, it was very difficult to cross and make it as far as Assyria for church. So again, another church was built because it was just too far to get to the church of their that they would have chosen to attend. Here's the interior of that church. It was a rather simple thing, but the altar painting is one of the most extraordinary of them all. And you can see that altar painting. It's Good Shepherd. It's a G.N. Malm from 1914. And it is absolutely an extraordinarily beautiful altar painting. When the Hallville Chapel closed in 1934, the altar painting was taken and was given to the Assyria Lutheran Church, and it's now prominently displayed in the Assyria Lutheran Church Fellowship Hall. But it is an extraordinary painting. Other than the Lutherans that we have mostly been talking about in the covenants, there were other denominations that started churches. There was Salemsborg, and 1 mile north was the Mission Hill Church, and then 1 mile farther north from that was this schoolhouse. This is District 24 Schoolhouse, and it was the site of the Swedish Methodist Church, the first Swedish Methodist church in the Smoky Valley. And they held services here for a number of years until finally they emerged and decided to move their church into the town of Lindsborg, because there were a lot of people who wanted to be Methodist in Lindsborg and not so many at here up where Smolin is now today. This particular building then was destroyed in 1892 with a tornado that also destroyed the town of Smolin. And the building was not rebuilt, but the school then was moved another mile north to the center of Smolin, across the street from the Covenant Church we saw earlier. Oh, so the Methodists then moved their Swedish Methodist Church to Lindsborg, and then they later on united with the English-speaking Methodists in Lindsborg, and they formed Trinity United Methodist Church, which still is located on Main Street in Lindsborg today. Here is another church, the Swedish Baptist churches. And this church was located about 7 miles to the west of where Fallen is. And it was, the building was erected in 1908, and it was never a very large congregation, but there were, excuse me, there were quite a few people that lived out in that area. However, in 1942, the government came in to form the Camp Phillips Army base in order to train soldiers for the war in Europe. And the area that this Baptist church served, all of the people had to leave in order for the government to take their land. All of those farms were abandoned, and of course this church was abandoned. And then finally, in 1948, there was a prairie fire out there, and the church was burned down during that prairie fire. There was also in Fallen, the town of Fallen was the Fallen Mission Covenant Church. It was organized in 1908, then disbanded in 1914. And this was located on the Andrew Malgrim farm, which is where the feedlot to the southwest of Fallen is located today in section 21. Fallen Swedish Baptist Church, then organized in 1910. A.B. Colvin was the first pastor, and they disbanded in 1918 and reunited with the Swedish Baptist Church in Lindsborg. The building was located north of the Fallen Bank, and the building then was sold to the Lutheran Church and became a fellowship hall until it was torn down in 1968. I have been able to find no pictures of this church. Fallen Lutheran Church is another very important and prominent church that was organized, again, because it was a long ways from Salemsborg. Fallen Christian Union Association was organized in 1875, and it was led by Major Eric Forsey, who was the founder of Fallen, led the church with former members of the Bishop Hill Colony from Knox County, Illinois. They were free thinkers, and it was a Laissez-faire church for their first years. The church was originally situated where the Fallen Cemetery is located today, which is 1 mile east of the present location. And when the Missouri Pacific railroad reached Fallen in 1886, it was decided that they would move the church into where the town of Fallen was established around the railroad station. And at that time, the FCUA was disbanded and Fallen Lutheran was established. I don't have a picture of it within this PowerPoint, but the altar painting inside the Fallen Church is also an extraordinary one. It was perhaps the first one. It's of Jesus praying in the Garden of Gethsemane. And it was perhaps the first of the many great altar paintings that Berger Sanzane painted. It was painted in 1898 and is an extraordinary thing to see. Here is the Fallen Church as it would have looked like in 1900, and the Fallen parsonage next to it. And here's what it looks like today. Still the same building. The steeple has been changed somewhat, but it is a very active and important congregation here in southern Saline County. All of these churches that we have looked at today have been disbanded, except for Fallen, except for Salemsborg, which are a joint parish now, and we share a lot of our ministry together and share a pastor, and then Assyria Lutheran Church. So although we have seen the Covenant churches, the Baptist churches, and the Methodist churches, they have been, those persons have joined into congregations either in Salina or mostly in Lindsborg. But the three main Lutheran churches of the valley still exist and are still here to this day. So that really ends my presentation of this. There are certainly time for questions. Would anyone have questions?
We will open it up for questions in just a minute. I neglected at the beginning to say that this was a project of the Smoky Valley Historical Association in partnership with the Lindsborg Old Mill and Swedish Heritage Museum, with a grant from Humanities Kansas. So we would like to thank Tom for his presentation this afternoon. Like I said, we will open it up for questions and answers.